are, cross fingers, halfway's decent schedule in here. Behold the barely readable patrons who very much help the project out every month, and with hopefully getting my Social Security check. We'll see what happens with the federal government squeaking by another month. So here we are, continuing to plow through Jeanson's sparsely documented book. And on page 163, quite a few pages after last week's episode, he bumps into a whopping 2 more sources. Wow. And they all relate to the JP58Y chromosomes of Jewish priests, citing Sharecki's paper from 1997, which I'll be putting a link up to, and Hammer's paper from 2000, involved pretty much the same team doing follow-up work, which I'll also be putting a link in. Now, Jeanson's version of that was to suggest that the regular scientists were claiming the thing arose 2,000 to 4,000 years ago, which would be just from the birth of Christ back 2000 BC. And since they discerned 2 different haplotype groups, a major group, this JP58, and this secondary group, Jeanson highlights that it looks like that the genes are not coming from a unique Aaron, which is supposedly where the priestly groups came from. But he doesn't stick with those dates. He applies his genetic scale, which scrunches everything down, to move the origin of that haplogroup, quote, up into the AD era. So we've got him claiming that he's got 2,000 to 4,000 years ago from the secular papers, but he's now going to pull that down somewhere unspecified in the Christian period for the origin of the genes in the priestly group that supposedly go way back into the Jewish kingdom. I think we're getting into a chronology problem here. So what do the actual papers report? The 1997 one pointed out that tradition puts the Jewish priesthood's origin as being, a quote, about 3,300 years ago, which would be 1300 BC. And the 2009 work certainly confirmed that, with the core lineage arising 3190 to plus or minus 1090 years ago, with the second largest element, the JM410, at slightly older, 4.2 plus or minus 1.3 thousand years. Now, here's where things get fun, because when you look at the original papers and the breakdowns that were done on these haplotypes compared to the cartoonish summary version that you're getting in Jeanson, he's also playing a squishy room on the dates, because where does he get that 2,000 to 4,000 year old range? What he's done is add on that margin for error, which actually are sigma values, which is in radiometric dating, typically it's 1 sigma, that you have an odds that the actual date will be 60%, 30% within 1 sigma and 60% within 2 sigma. That's if you want to get super duper technical about it. But at any rate, he's having to add that value on to pull that margin down to 2,000 years ago, but he doesn't do the same thing with the other direction, which if he did would come up with 5,500 years for the outer range, which is perilously close to the age of the earth in the creationist model, and way before the flood, and therefore way before the Jewish kingdom, and therefore way before even the tradition says that it's the case. So what he's done now is effectively looked at technical papers that are confirming the Jewish tradition about when priestly development came about, which fits nicely the regular chronology. And because he has to move the chronology down, he shreds all of that information, and without any documentation, just so ever so casually, oh my, well, it's in the AD period. Woo! Which is why I'm calling this episode Tracing Fiddling on the Priestly Roof. My gosh, this is in exactly the same problem that Jeanson is facing with these other haplotypes, where the most recent examples of them, he's pulling way too far down compared to what we actually know their dating are. But now it's directly requiring shredding the Jewish tradition. Now, part two. Hi, Barbara. Oh, Skid in your sick bed. Yes, absolutely. Get some chicken soup and hot chamomile tea or whatever it takes to get revved up. Our weather has been yo-yoing up and down here in Spokane between rainstorms, and now we're supposedly going back to heat wave, and so and plus smoke coming in from Canadian fires. So it's been a busy opportunity for problems. So yes, hi, Barbara, and get back to bed and watch the show later. Part two of the little episode has to do with some more of our dear fan of Jerry Bergman, the always manipulative fellow. And there's a little posting in Creation Magazine from just this last year that came up on Creation Ministries International, ginkgo, remarkable living fossil, which is the usual shtick that you're expecting, but it was funny to start looking at the little details. He's up to his old deck stacking tricks with ginkgos. He puts them in supposedly as an evolutionary problem. The shell game here involves selectively relying on older information while not following up on more recent stuff. He dangles a paper on the therapeutic aspects of the tree. Nice, gee whiz, wonderful, but it has nothing to do with the point of issue about supposed evolutionary problems. That was a paper from 2006, which I'll be sticking the link up so you can take a look at it. And then he couldn't resist dangling a 2017 paper from Herrera Flores on the tuatara as another living fossil, without discussing its contents, of course, which put that critter into both its morphological and paleontological context in a way no creationist has, least of all Jerry Bergman. So you can have fun reading the cartoon compact version in Jerry Bergman versus what was actually in the technical paper that he went out of his way to cite. But we're not done. Finally, he gets down to a book from 2015 by Peter Crane, on where along the way he mentions the phylogeny of the ginkgo plants, and implying that Crane actually had some speculations about what was going on here, but Bergman neglects to mention that. Now, the book isn't readily available, but Bergman did put up a paper on the draft genome of the ginkgo from 2016, Guan 2016, which I'll be putting the link up to, which doesn't mention their observation of the gradual genome expansion in the ginkgos, quote, between 15 and 24 million years ago, unquote. But it also meant that the relevant genetic information to clarify the ginkgos only came the year after Crane's book. So tiptoeing back in time to 2015 to pick up an authority quote from somebody in a general book, rather than dealing with the implications of the technical work that appeared after that, and which he went out of his way to cite and not discuss. We're not quite done, because the area did not stop research. There was a 2021 paper, which, by the way, is before Bergman's 2022 article in Creation Magazine from Liu, which I will be putting a link on, which found that the genes that drive ginkgo specificity involve particularly ones, quote, associated with the formation of the spermatophore flagellum, which has been lost in all seed plants except ginkgos and cycads, unquote. In other words, it has a very unusual derived characteristic that made it hard to classify, because now we're looking at organisms that don't have that feature versus these remnant groups way back in time for which the fossil record was fairly sparse. And speaking of which, what is the fossil record of that? Does Bergman make a point of telling us? No. But Zhao and Zhang did from 2003, again, years before Bergman's 2022 post. They noted how sparse the fossil record for them was, highlighting a rare Cretaceous example. But things have moved on by the time Bergman's writing, because the 2017 paper, which ironically enough, Crane, the guy who wrote the 2015 book, was involved in as one of the authors, contributed to Herrera 2017 from PNAS, which I'll be putting a link up to, which indicated there was a lot of plant diversity that had ended up only as fragmentary bits in the fossil record. which was another part of why working out ginkgo relationships hundreds of millions of years after the fact, in some cases, have been so much harder to tinker with. So Bergman is very true to form on this, and it reminds us of a general principle that if a creationist brings up a topic, you want to look at every source they bring up if you can. And fortunately, so much of that's available directly these days, as I've been showing. And two, check to see whether or not they're deck stacking the material they do present or ignoring its contents completely, which Bergman just did. And or are they relying on old material or sidebar material rather than going in and diving into the material that is actually presented? And on top of which, something else that was missing in Bergman's argument. What exactly is the baraminology of ginkgos? How many baramins are there? Or are they part of a larger baramin? That's in principle something that all creationists would have to deal with. But you know, there's an awful lot of plants and an awful lot of plant families and an awful lot of fossil plants that would have to be categorized. And then, of course, you'd have to deal with how do they come about since the flood in some cases, or what was the diversification of the paleo environments that existed supposedly prior to the flood. And then you have to include all of the nematodes and all the other and arthropods and all the marine critters. And you can see that there is a problem, which Bergman as an individual, and he's, I think, my age, although he tends to put a picture of himself looking much, much younger when they show it. But from what I can tell, he's an old, desiccated fart like me. That they don't come up with any of that material. And if there had in fact been, my screensaver seemed to be blocking on there. If there had in fact been such material, wouldn't our creationists have been perfectly happy to cite it? You would have thought. But there is no there. And so you could catalog in almost every instance when a creationist goes out of their way to bring up a subject, you want to keep those elements in mind of what sources are they bringing up, what sources are old, what follow-up do they fail to do, and then what's their model, and why aren't they citing their own material, especially if there's been years and years and years and years and years and years and years where theoretically, if the creationist methodology were so fantastically powerful over all of these decades, that Bergman himself has been a little busy beaver writing apologetic articles that read pretty much like the ones that I'm linking to this time. Why wouldn't they have come up with anything? So that's where we're sticking in on that. And now I was just finishing up some more material on the Rocks Were There Volume 2, some material on the Manu Hindu flood, which was a little sidebar. Oh, notice the creationists seem to chafe at the idea of the new study make their old resources obsolete. Well, there is the thing that we're finding out when the young Earth creationists, and this happens functionally only in young Earth creationism because there isn't really any old Earth creationism other than you, Ross, and Fazal Rana. And intelligent design is basically the people at the Discovery Institute repeating themselves over and over again. So almost all of the fun stuff in the theoretical department is taking place in creationism. And you have got CMI, Creation Ministries International, which was the other half of Answers in Genesis that fissioned off. And then you got the Institute for Creation Research. And then you have an assortment of creationist venues, these creationist conferences that they show every once in a while. I think one of the most recent one was from 2018. I think there maybe have been one from 2021. I'm not sure. I haven't seen any information on that. The most recent biggie was in 2018, which is now 5 years ago. And then some of the other miscellaneous journals, that's where you get the fistfights between the various camps. And those tend to coalesce around the various organizations. So you've got like Tim Clary and company trying to move the flood boundary past the Cretaceous. You've got Guliuza at ICR trying to obliterate natural selection, which I mentioned and we'll be discussing in Volume 2, Rocks Were There. And then you've got the bunch at Answers in Genesis. Ken Ham is pretty much launching a jihad against the creationists who are actually trying to do the baraminology for letting in too much of that creationism stuff. Not a heck of a lot of young people involved in the case. Every once in a while, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 a year at most, of new names operating in that field that are writing articles in the stuff. And sometimes there's somebody who actually has a pedigree in the creationist literature that's gone back quite a ways, but they've basically been off the shelf, and they come up and suddenly, poof, they're doing an article in Creation magazine. All of that's the official PhD creationist level. Way below that, of course, are the seat of the pants smorgasborders, your Nephilim Freeze and Standing for Truths and all that. And they will, and Sal Cordova, and of course, functionally, Eric Hovin would be falling into that category, because he's essentially latching on to a whole bunch of people in the Answers in Genesis CMI orbit and repeating their material. They're the secondary redactors, and the farther you go down that food chain, the more likely you are that they're winging it. And in creationism, nothing is more hilarious than to see a creationist winging it, because now they have to kind of apply what they think is going on, but since there isn't really a coherent model, they can veer off into all sorts of little wacky directions, and you get some who start arguing that, I think even Todd Wood, or was it Kurt Wise, who was thinking that some of the, one of the baraminologists on the sidebar was arguing that some of the oil deposits came from the blood of organisms squished in the flood. Okay. And that was an interesting little sidebar. But it's not a terrible problem for creationists regarding old source usage, because they don't care that they're old sources. This is part of the proof text tradition, and let me type that in there so you can all kind of see proof texts. Type the letter. There we go. Proof texting is an old tradition in religious apologetics. It's where you say, Isaiah such and so says, or in the creationist context, look at this quote from Stephen Jay Gould. He says this, or Charles Darwin's I quote, or so forth and so on. And since the biblical apologetic tradition is that the text can just be taken as an immovable object that you can then plop down, regardless of context, regardless of whether the person changed their mind, or regardless of how old it is, as a quote. Any creationist operating in that frame see no reason to change it particularly. Another variable is how much the creationist is relying on older apologetics. And if they're an old fart like me, it's very possible that they're drawing on a lot of material from old books that they have. So they might have an old copy of Duane Gish or Henry Morris, and they're simply repeating that material, or Kent Hoving for that matter, who's my age, trotting out stuff that he's from Walt Brown's website. A different kettle of fish are the newer generations, the Standing for Truths and that crowd, because they're basically riffing off of an entirely different video tradition, online postings. And that means that an awful lot of niggling details that would have been an obsession or interest in the scholarship of creationism 30, 40, 50 years ago in print is invisible to them, because they don't know they are there. How many young earth creationists under 30 have read a Duane Gish book? Any? I don't know. And so you will get some, like that bunch over in Rathdrum, Idaho, that were glomming onto various Tim Clary apologetics and others that were made available through Creation Ministries International. So you can get a recycling of the newer material, and some of that, because after we get finished with Jeanson's book, we will be wanting to do Jonathan Sarkey and Joel Tay's book on Titans, which is their stab at dinosaur creationism, which I picked up at that Rathdrum meeting. That will give us an indication of just how much new is in it versus how much isn't, because there's no reference bibliography, but there are footnotes. It's structured an awful lot like a Pandas and People, which also doesn't have a reference bibliography, but has footnotes at the end of the chapter. So they're kind of following. I, scholarly groupie that I am, want to know exactly what that's going on. Anyway, I mentioned, I get back from my derailed train of thought, Hindu creationism and the Manu flood legend, which I had some little notes on that. It doesn't really pop up much in Western creationist lore, and for probably a lot of reasons, because it carries with it a certain amount of Hindu baggage, and the Hindus can have, since they invented zeros, often talk about billions of years, and so there's a different frame for them. But it turns out that that actually impacts modern day Indian politics, because there's a conservative brand, think Donald Trump plus sitars, that currently run India today, and they are terribly Hindu nationalists. And there's a Hindu nationalistic branch of archaeology that is funded by the government that tries to reinforce the various Vedic narratives. And that's going to be part of the discussion, even to the point of where some scientists have to kind of kowtow to this mythology, even if they don't necessarily believe it, or they may actually believe it, but they kind of keep it under wraps when they're writing secular science papers. And it involves things like, how many rivers were there in the times of the Harappa culture? Are the rivers coming from the Himalayas or from monsoons? You'd think that this is a purely technical issue. It has theological implications. And some of these issues of staid archaeology can turn deadly. In the 1990s, thousands of Indians died in massacres, in riots, caused by the fact that a mosque was demolished because supposedly underneath it were supposedly more ancient Hindu-oriented material, and the place in question was sacred as supposedly the place where Rama was born. And you can see, so the circumstances that you have with the Temple Mount and things in Jerusalem, there's the exact counterpart of that in India, and it can turn deadly. So we're in an interesting world with Modi running India. And of course, it looks like Erdogan is continuing to be in power in Turkey, and you've got Orban in Hungary, and you have Putin in Russia, and you have Xi in the PRC, and an assortment of other little baby tyrants knocking around in various spots. So our 2020s are exceedingly exciting. And as I have pointed out in other contexts, this reminds me too much of the 1920s, which slid into the 1930s, which slid into World War II, which slid into, let's put it, deep shit. So the next few decades are going to be an interesting thing to see what happens as to whether or not ideologically driven pseudo-archaeology and ideologically driven medical science and ideologically driven fill in the blank is going to keep running amok. Or whether or not we can kind of pull the reins on that and reestablish a tradition of proper source citation and coordination with scientific reason, and not having to follow the political or religious ideologies of people relying on the Bronze Age. So that I think can cover us for a good thing. We got about a good half hour, almost half hour in. The signal seems to be running good, but that's got the main material out of the way, and will be structured for the next installments of stuff. I am quite delighted at all of the material that's going into volume 2 of the Rocks Were There. Hopefully, we'll end up with a volume that is no bigger than that, because that's as big as you can print at Amazon.com. I've already got an awful lot of source material lined up. And of course, Jackson will have his material, so we'll see what's happened. In fact, several of the little info boxes that I had worked up on various topics got so massive that I've consolidated some of them as appendices in the book. So it's a lot of things. Plus, there's a moving target, which new material keeps coming on down the line that I want to make sure is put in the case, like these new things like about the Manu flap and Hindu creationism. So everybody stay safe and cool, or warm if you're in places that get cool, and don't accept any wooden penguins. Hopefully the government will not have collapsed by the time we get into June, and we can move on to see what the hell is going to happen for the rest of the year and the rest of the decade, and see whether or not we can survive the 21st century. Okay, well, everybody stay safe till next week.